So hello and good afternoon to our New Economy Shortcuts, July 24. We are very happy to have a very distinguished author of a recently published book with us, Eric Monnet, who is professor of history and economics at the ESS in Paris and the Paris School of Economics, which is easier to understand. And he has just recently published his book that he will present today, Balance of Power, and then discuss it on the modern challenges for central banks. And we are very happy to have that Peter Bofinger has, in short notice, joined to discuss the book. And we are very much looking forward to the discussion between the two of you, and then inviting all of the people in the room, in the digital room, to join the discussion later on. So happy to have you both, and I would ask Eric to start and give a quick overview of the main messages that are in your book.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Thank you very much also, Peter, for accepting to discuss the book, and indeed on a short notice. And to all the team of the New Forum, I'm very happy to discuss this new book, which was published few weeks ago. So I'm usually an economic historian, but this is not an economic history book. This is a book that deals with current central bank issues. And also the book contains a bit of history. I think I still use this historical perspective to inform the current debates. It really also tried really to go into what we can do today with central bank. But so let me share my screen so that I can see you. So here we go. So the topic in this book is really to try to reframe how we think about central banks today. And I've been doing that for now several years. And as I said before, it's not an economic history work, but it's informed by economic history, because in economic history we have seen many different models of central banks over time. And I think we are in this period where we know that a kind of new central bank model is coming, but we don't know yet which kind of model is coming. So it's very likely that what central banks do will be not very different from what they did 10 years ago, but there's a lot of uncertainty on their institutional framework and their monetary policy strategy. So it's still useful to start from the difference between how central bank worked 20 years ago and what they now do. I mean, I think there's big consensus now among economists and also among policymakers, I would say, that the central banking model that we have known in Europe, in the US, so in many Western economies, that started in the 1990s. And I'd say that central banking was supposed to be easy and very technocratic, just like it was enough to follow a simple rule. This consensus has really collapsed. I mean, this idea that there would be no side effect of central bank decision, that indeed only the interest rate can manage everything, it's clearly not that what we see today and what we have seen in the last 15 to 20 years. So everything that was suddenly called unconventional monetary policy in the last few years have become fully conventional. So that's why I say that we think we are in time of this time period where a new model is coming, where we don't know exactly why. And the last 10 years have been this kind of undefined years of transition. So we are moving from the idea that central banks can only rely on interest rates in response to inflation, which obviously does not mean that they cannot do not longer care about inflation. They do not longer use interest rates. They still do. It's very important, but they do many other things. There have been large asset processes, which has quite an important impact on the distribution of wealth and on asset prices, targeted loans, financial stability matters, foreign lending also, the famous swaps between central banks. And what we have seen also is that there have been a kind of divergence between the different models of central banks. I mean, if you look at what the US central bank is doing today, the Bank of Japan and the ECB, if you look at the detail of the operation, it's quite different. okay, which is what not much less the case 20 years ago, but it's reminiscent of historical period where actually central banks are more embedded into their national economies, and so also their model diverge. Another things we have learned in the last years, and I think is also very important, is that central bank independence, which I think is still a very valuable concept, but central bank independence have been shown to be much more complex than what we have seen, what we thought before as economists. I mean, it was seen as something, again, quite clearly defined, and which was always beneficial for the central bank. But on the other hand, what we have seen recently, well, actually, there's a bit of a trap sometimes of central bank independence, because governments will try to avoid the responsibility and ask more and more to the central bank, so that actually the central banks can end being what is sometimes said to be the only game in town, because central banks, governments, sorry, assume that central banks will take in charge some policies that they do not want to take into account. And there are other things which have, so there's also a need for redefinition of what central bank independence is, and how can this notion can be better and more effective. And the last, there are obviously new challenges ahead. So one of public debt, of very high public debt. I mean, it's not new in history, but the configuration that we have today, that we have a strong welfare state, that public debt is mostly issued on financial market and traded on financial market. This configuration is quite new. So it's not something where you can easily rely on the past to know exactly what to do. And the same are obviously true for anything related to climate change, which is an enormous issue, and to which central banks still do not know exactly how to deal with. And the same is true for digital currency, obvious, which is again something that there is very little that you can learn from history when you think about these challenges. So in this book, I discuss all these new challenges, but especially at the end of the book, I mean, it's really a book that tries to describe what central banks do and these different challenges I named before. But at the beginning of the book, there is more like, let's say, a bit of conceptual part, which try to give new insights about what central banks really are and what they really do, and also to situate the current politics in historical perspective. So for this, I emphasize the following notion, which I think for me were quite important to understand the function of central bank and what's performed in current societies. And I think that central banks, but really from the start, I mean, even though their role have changed over time, but they always have performed an insurance function. I think it's very important to understand this, that they've always been there to insure both the private sector and the state during big economic shock. So it's been quite constant over time, but obviously since both the nature of the economic shocks, but also the nature of the state and the nature of the financial system have changed over time, today this insurance function is very particular. It is not really like anything we have known in the past. And I think what makes this is this coincidence of very large welfare state, larger than ever, and also the large financialization of public debt. So that central banks really stand as crucial institutions that have to, in some ways, to attempt to ensure that this large welfare state and this big financial system, which relies partly on public debt, are not going to collapse. So I think it's many people have said, but I think it's still important to have in mind perhaps what central banks do instead of, for example, focusing only on price stability issues. The second thing is that this notion of credit policy, which have been very strong in the history of central banks, but have been discredited a lot especially by Milton Friedman and other monetarists starting in the 1950s. And the idea of credit policy, that central banks affect a lot of part of the credit market given their actions. So they not only have to affect macroeconomic variables, so that inflation or money supply, but in some ways they always affect a bit the allocation of credit in the economy, on purpose or not on purpose. So this idea of credit policy, I think it's very important to avoid this kind of illusion that central banks will not have impact on the distribution of credit or the allocation or even the competition between financial institutions. I think that everything they do have some impact on the profit of banks, competition, but also allocation of credits, obviously at very different degrees. So, but central banks are not the only institutions involved in credit policy, and that's very important as well. So if you think, for example, in the European context, there is a European Investment Bank. In the US, there is Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. So when Fannie and Freddie purchase mortgage bonds, this has a huge impact on the US financial market, including money market rates. So if you don't think the coordination and the interactions between the central banks and these other institutions, state institutions that in some ways deal with credit policy, it's actually very difficult to understand what is going on in financial markets. And it's really something I'm pushing forward in the book, is not to take central banks in isolation, but to take central banks among all the kind of state credit policies, from banking regulation to public bank, which means that there is a need for coordination. I think something that have been forgotten, that we should really think about the coordination between central banks' actions and other actions of credit policies. So the first thing is this idea that actually central bank mandate, contrary to what is often said, are not narrow at all. I mean, if you look at any central bank law, you will see that actually it's very vague. It's very vague, and it's very vague because many contingencies are possible, and it's a typical, what we call a typical incomplete contract. So it's not narrow. And so what do you do when you have such an incomplete contract? And so the central banks will always have to invent new kind of policies or strategies when they face unforeseen contingencies. So for this, the only way to deal with that in a democracy, and for this I relied on a lot of political theory in the book, is to have very strong accountability and also to have very strong balanced deliberation between the parliament and the central bank. So it's not only about delegation. I mean, many economists always say, okay, it's the parliament that delegates to the central bank the function of price stability on this, but actually it's much more, you need to have much more than this. It's not only delegation, but it's really deliberation. So how to set up this deliberation is a very important question. And the last thing is about central bank independence. I'm still among the people who defend central bank independence, but still that it needs to be redefined. And I think the way one good reason for central bank independence that is surprisingly not always clearly formulated is that central bank independence is important in a democratic society to be sure that there is a balance of power between the executive and the legislative. Okay, because if for example, the government can just ask the central banks to finance the budget, then everything would be said in the parliament about the budget and public finance will be destroyed by the fact that the government could use at will the central bank. So these are, I think, key insights of the book, which are then applied to many cases and different things, from central bank digital currency to foreign lending in terms of swaps. But let me here just to finish this introduction, to focus on two other specific proposals in the book. The first one is how to make this deliberation effective and balance of power or accountability effective. And there was this proposals that I made, and now that have been discussed by many people, many other people, lawyers and political scientists, for example, on the European Credit Council. And also there are some proposals to do the same for the United States. So the main objective of this would be to create a body that would increase the debates around central bank decisions, okay? Because what we see now is that when central banks are taking decisions, they are almost the only institution to justify what they're doing. And there are very few debates, and even at the parliament, if you look at the dialogue, it's not a very balanced debate. So the idea would be to increase the debate and the variety of opinions on the ECB strategy. And it's not, the purpose of this is not to put pressure on the ECB. It's just to be sure that the ECB, when the ECB takes a decision, that the ECB can prove that it has taken all possible configurations, all possible scenarios into account. And so it's a way to force the ECB to have much more justification of their choices and justification that take into account all the solutions. And so at the end, it will not put pressure on the ECB, but it's just like increasing the legitimacy of the ECB and avoid what we have seen in Europe in the last years, that actually the last say on monetary policy and ECB policy just goes to the European Court of Justice. Okay, and I think it's not a sign of good functioning democracy, but it's the Court of Justice, which at the end I just need to have a say, just deciding whether the ECB is doing well. And I think it just shows that the debates at the Parliament were not enough. So the purpose of this body will be first to to make credit policies at the EU level more visible and more coordinated, so that we know when the central bank is taking decision, in one way is it consistent, for example, with the issue of loans by the Commission or the loan by the ECB, to be sure that there is a consistent credit policy at the EU level. And the second thing would be to have much more independent expertise at the EU Parliament to have a more balanced and a debate with the ECB, reflecting also a variety of opinion. So in the book, but also in several other recent pieces with my colleague Jens Van Kloster, we have explained how this could be applied to the issue of climate change. I mean, as you may know, there is a new kind of dilemma for the central bank related to climate change regarding inflation. If, for example, the idea is very simple and it's very intuitive. It's just to say that if the central banks today, for example, increase interest rates very strongly to fight inflation, but if doing so is discouraged investment in renewable energy, that will in the medium term actually be a solution to avoid too high cost of energy. But actually, the central banks today, by only raising interest rates, could affect negatively inflation in the medium term. So it's a kind of new dilemma for central banks on which there is very little knowledge. And so it's a typical case where we need new models, we need new scenarios to think about it. But the central banks cannot do it itself. I mean, it's not only the economists at the ECB which are going to decide what they do with climate change and what is this new trade-off, and especially to define what is green, what is not green in the economy, which kind of energy or technology are better to stabilize prices in the medium and long term. So it's a typical case where I think that the ECB should be involved. I mean, the ECB cannot neglect climate change today, even if the ECB is only pursuing its first primary objective of price stability. But if the ECB really want to tackle climate change, it cannot be without coordination with other bodies, and it cannot be without a stronger discussion with the Parliament to increase legitimacy. So this is just one example of the many ways we could apply this kind of new thinking or new framework about central banking. I was probably already too long, and now I leave the floor to Peter, and really looking forward to his comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. Yes, I hand over to Peter.
Yeah, thank you. So let me see whether I can share my screen. Second. And here. Now it will screen. 1 second. So now you should be able to see it. It's okay?
Yes.
Can see me, hear me, great. So yeah, thank you very much for asking me to discuss this book. I think it's a fascinating book, which has many, many interesting issues and insights. Unfortunately, I didn't have too much time to read it in detail. And so if I do not fully understand some of the issues, so it's really due to the fact that maybe I could not read it carefully enough. Okay, so going through the book. So what are the main arguments? I think it starts with a strong statement that central banks' monetary policies and the bank's creation of money must be subject to democratic control. These powers are too important to be managed solely by independent authorities operating as not facing technocrats. When you read this, say, oh, wow, the whole monetary policy should be subject to democratic control. But then just without much difference, then comes the argument, the point is not to question the independence of central banks. That is the principles according to which they make their decisions without instructions from government. Indeed, such independent administrative authorities are a legitimate component of modern democracies. So they say, hey, wow, first he says it must be subject to democratic control, but then comes the point, no, central bank independence should not be questioned. And it's also, then the argument is okay that saying, well, central bank interventions often serve as a protection for states that are incapable of undertaking reforms of the financial system or of constructing a coherent credit policy. So that explains why it's important to have central bank independence and not subject monetary policies to something like democratic control. Then there comes a new argument saying, well, but there are new tasks for central banks, new roles for central banks to play, and these are three domains: ecological transition, price of public debt, and new forms of digital money. And from this, it is argued, well, having these new domains, the legal independence is not enough, so something in addition is required. But then, especially when talking about the role of the central bank in the ecological transition or the price of public debt, the argument is, I believe there is a real danger to democracy in expecting too much from unelected institutions with ill-defined balance of power. So it's going first in one direction and then in the other, and it's not so clear where it is heading to. But then if you look at the solution that is proposed, I would say it's a relatively modest solution, and Eric has just presented it. Say, okay, we need structural sources of economic expertise for the parliament. Yes, it's always good if they have more economists, can have a more qualitative assessments. And we must say that the parliament is using experts for preparatory papers for the monetary dialogue. So there is already a lot of expertise in the parliament. But I would agree that this monetary dialogue is not really what it was supposed to be. It's not a real challenge for the ECB politicians. When they come to the parliament, they make their speech, and then the questions are more or less polite, and so it's not a real challenge. Therefore, one can say, okay, we need a new institution, the European Credit Council, and it should be assigned to study the consequences of monetary and credit policies for the economic as a whole, and also to make proposals to the central bank so that its policy might fully complement other European economic, social, and credit policies. Yes, such a council might be interesting, but the book says the Credit Council would not make decisions. It just suggests some kind of policies. So it would be a rather weak institution. But of course, I would say, yes, why not? Why not want to do that? Why not try to get more coordination? But it's not what one would think of. Say, okay, there must be democratic control of the central bank. So that's definitely, so in my view, it's a solution one can discuss, but I would say it's a very modest solution. And I don't think that one should expect too much from it. So overall, I agree, more coordination might be a good thing. Then I have some more conceptual problems. So this definition, credit policy versus monetary policy. So the book says the credit policy refers to all types of state interventions that deal with the development and allocation of credit and money and their distributional consequences. Then it says monetary policy, how central banks influence macroeconomic aggregates, money prices, regardless of distributional effects. And then it says, in addition to the conduct of monetary policy, central banks participate in a country's credit policy. And I have some difficulty with this definition because, in my view, monetary policy is always credit policy. There's no monetary policy that's no credit policy. So if you target short-term interest rates, you target these interest rates in order to target the growth of private credit in the economy. So that's credit policy. If you purchase government bonds, it's also credit policy, and I don't think it's a kind of new model of monetary policy, as you said, because central banks have always purchased the government bonds, even the Bundesbank in its youth, in order to keep long-term rates low. So I wouldn't say this is something completely new. It was not as important for many years, but and in the United States after the Second World War, the Federal Reserve was actively buying long-term government bonds in order to keep long-term rates low. So I would say monetary policy is credit policy. And then the question is, what is the additional credit policy? And how important is it in relation to the credit monetary policy of the central bank? And then I only see the role of institutions like the European Investment Bank or Credit Anstalt für Wiederaufbau. But I don't think this would be on equal footing, but maybe I have to read this in more detail, but I have some problem with it. Then the book has some confusion between monetary base and money. So it says to buy or lend financial securities, the central bank creates money. That is, the money that it lends did not exist beforehand. But of course, it's monetary base, and in some pages later, it also gets clear what you mean. But for the reader, it's confusing because central bank is not creating money in that sense. It's creating base money. And that also leads to the question, answers the question that you do in the book. Why didn't this period of extraordinary monetary creation automatically create a strong rise in the rate of inflation long before the end of COVID? Yes, because it was base money creation and not creation of the money stock in three. So that's of course, if one reads the book, one can find out, but it would be easier for the reader to say, well, these are different forms of money, and the money that the central bank creates is not the money that is relevant for aggregate demand. Then there is the need for central bank digital currencies. And the book says, thus the stakes for states, central banks are clear. They have to issue their own cryptocurrencies to address the different threats that hang over their sovereignty and the financial protection of their cities. So what central banks are doing right now, discussing right now, is not cryptocurrencies, but it's central bank digital currencies. And that's just the opposite of a cryptocurrency, I would say. It's just an ordinary bank deposit, but it's a bank deposit not held with the commercial banks, but held with the central bank. So it's not crypto, it's not distributed ledgers, it's just kind of ordinary bank account, but a bank account with the central bank. And without going into detail, I'm very skeptical whether it's a good idea that central banks try to issue a kind of digital cash, what the central bank digital currency is. I don't think that this is something that people will really long for, because the people that are using cash today, also they could 100%, almost 100% pay digital, is that they don't like digital, and they have their reason why they want to have it physical, not digital. And so if the central bank creates something like digital cash, it's, in my view, not something that for which there will be a large demand. And what the ECB is creating currently with the digital euro is a parallel universe of accounts and settlement institutions, which is, in my view, extremely costly and absolutely not the best way to create an independent European payment scheme. But that's another story. Finally, what I find important, and that's what you also said, is the role of the central bank and other institutions in anti-inflation policies. And I think that's a very important point, that it's not a good idea to expect inflation control in an environment, especially with supply only from the central bank. I think the coordination between the central bank and fiscal policy is important, and that's in fact what also happened. So I've written a study for Böckler Stiftung, and you also say that in your book, that of course the governments during the energy price shock have done a lot to keep inflation somehow under control, and that's exactly what is needed. And I fully agree with what you said. Governments and central banks would benefit from making more formal joint commitments on economic trajectories and how the mix between fiscal and monetary policy can contribute to these objectives. I think this is a very, very important point. Yeah, so make a little bit of advertisement for my own paper. That's something I have explained in detail in this study for the Böckler Stiftung. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Eric, a lot of questions.
Sorry. I can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm now on mute. Yeah, so thank you very much, Peter. That's very perfect for discussion. These are really key important points, I think, that go directly into the main issues of the book. So let me start to respond briefly, and let me start with the easiest question. So first, on which we very much agree. So first, I mean, your last comment, obviously, I think it's, I mean, indeed, this coordination, and you take the example of fiscal policy, budget policy, but also of price controls. I mean, and it's, I mean, so when I first, I mean, the first version of the book was published in France 3 years ago. So at that time, it was still, now during the last 3 years, I mean, many more economists agree that we need this coordination, and I think that's very important. I mean, it's a bit insane to think that, you know, some government can respond to inflation by having this price control or subsidies, and there is no coordination about the central bank. And it's insane in terms of economic efficiency and economic policies, which now I think is more and more recognized, probably not enough, but more and more. But the thing I also emphasize in the book, I think it's also a problem in terms of democratic debate. I think it's very bad to have all these policies which are not consistent. I think that if you think about what democracy is supposed to be, it's also supposed that the people is supposed to understand what is going on. And if there is no coordination, that becomes very difficult to understand what is public policy. On the monetary base and money, I fully agree on that. I mean, so maybe I revise the terms in the book. On monetary policy and credit policy, the distinction on this as well. I think it's I agree with you that moving interest rate is a kind of credit policy, and I think it's interesting that Milton Friedman, when you have that, I mean, as we know, Friedman was very against using interest rate. It was more for the money supply. So Friedman was saying, oh, interest rates are so it's a very distributive policy. So moving interest rate is a very strong state in the interventionism. And although I don't agree with this conclusion, I think I agree on the principle that indeed, like moving interest rate is something that has a very large consequence on the oil credit markets, and not only on the level of inflation, for example. So I still keep the terms of monetary policy because it's so widely used in the economic profession. Yeah, I think the key message here is that monetary policy is always kind of credit policy, but credit policy is not only done by the central bank. So central bank's credit policy needs coordination with other kind of credit policy.
Okay.
And then I think your two very strong point at the beginning, and I must say that a lot of the debates around the book has revolved around these two issues. That people often ask me, okay, why do you still defend central bank independence if you want more democratic control? And the second one is, isn't your proposal of European Economic Council too modest? So on the first one, why I still defend central bank independence, and why I do think that it's not incompatible with strong democratic control. So first, I mean there is no. I mean, the parliament can still change the central bank law. I mean, so that is not the central bank itself, and the independence of central bank itself is a produce of democracy. It can be the produce of democracy because there is a law of central bank which is voted by the parliament. So then the question is, why do we have these independent institutions? And in the book, where I try to absorb a lot of literature that we have from political science and political theory that explain why we have independent institutions in a society, in democratic society. So that can be so the most obvious case is for justice, I mean, for the courts, but it's a bit particular because the central bank is not a power in itself. But we have a lot. We have, like, for example, competition authority, media control authority. So it's not illegitimate in a democracy to have independent institution, especially, and when I think it's a case with central bank, and actually it's not something new, it's been recognized for like centuries, that the problem with central bank is that if there is no independence, it will give too power to the government instead of at the expense of the power of the parliament. And it's like, for the media control authority, for example, if you don't have if you have a public radio, but the government can decide who is sitting on the public radio, okay, it gives too much power to the government. And I think it's the same with the central bank. So I think that's why I still defend central bank independence. But again, it's not contradictory with democratic control for this first reason, that actually the parliament can still change the law of the central bank. But also for this second reason, which I think is a bit original in the book, is to say that actually we should not think about the change in the law, but really the deliberation. And it's here that I still try to think that these debates that could take place at the parliament, it's not at the end a modest solution. I think that if you think about if it really works, if the ECB really has to think that when they will take a decision, possibly they will be challenged by a parliament that will, provide alternative scenarios, alternative solution that could really say, okay, you're taking this decision of interest rate, but look, we have all these studies that will show that actually rising interest rate in front of inflation can have adverse effect on this, and also it might not be the only solution. Then the ECB really have to think twice about everything. So I think in terms of, the constraint that the institution is going to take into account, I think this can quite an important changes. And it's the same when you look at how the ECB now internalize what have been the court cases of the European Court of Justice. I think the European Court of Justice cases has quite a lot of impact on how the ECB now think about what they do, and that what they do needs to be legal according to the European Court of Justice. And I think it will be a bit the same with the Parliament. I think that it will change the idea that the central bank can decide itself on almost everything. And the other reason why I think it's not at the end a modest proposal is that I think these proposals are a bit informed by what existed in many European countries in 1950s and 1960s, where there was this kind of credit councils to coordinate central bank policy with other kind of policies. And again, if you have more coordination, you also have potentially have more power of this kind of policy. So I think it could be. It looks like very modest, but if it really works, it could have much more impact at what is usually found, because it will really change the way what we look, that central banks think about the policy that they can do, and really push them to think about credit policy and not only monetary policy. So we think it would be quite a more radical change than it looks on paper.
Can I shortly comment on this?
Yes, please.
Yes.
So the first point is, well, the central bank law can be changed, but of course, in the case of the ECB, it's extremely difficult because it has to go through the whole ratification process in all member states. So that would be difficult. But in principle, you're right. Then the question is why do we need an independent central bank? In my view, it derives from the time horizons. I think the problem, if you have politicians who can run the central bank, they would try to find some short-term solutions before elections. And I think, in my view, the main justification for independent central banks is that they have a long-term time horizon, so that they have appointments for 8 years, that they have staggered appointments. And I think that's something which gives this kind of long-term perspective and avoids this kind of political cycles or something like that. So that's my explanation why it's important for the central bank to be independent. And then, of course, you say it's important for the ECB to be challenged, but of course it is challenged, isn't it? I think we have so many macroeconomists, so many scientists. I think that would be their job to challenge the ECB. Huh? No, I think what are people doing with all their macro models? I think that it's their job to challenge the ECB. So we wouldn't need to hire some people for the European Parliament. We have hundreds or thousands, I don't know, of young macroeconomists all doing all their models, and they should challenge the ECB. Astonishingly, they don't do it. I think that's one of the fancy things, strange things, that we don't see all the papers where some people say, okay, my model says the ECB must lower interest rates now, otherwise this will happen more. So there's almost nothing, but that would be our job as macroeconomists to challenge the ECB. And I must say that if you listen to the speeches by the executive board members, they do a lot to explain why they do it. So there's a huge effort, as I see it, from all members of the executive board to explain in details these models in a more general way, but then in all kind of academic events. So I think they do a lot. So that's even without this council being there. And then what I find, so I can imagine relatively easily coordination between fiscal policy and monetary policy, but how can you get a coordination between the ECB's macroeconomic policy, what I would say, with the credit policies, let's see, of the European Investment Bank? How can you coordinate that?
I mean, I can answer, but maybe, I don't know, Thomas, would you like to take question for Q&A or?
Yes, if you answer this question quickly and then.
So this question quickly, I mean, the most straightforward answer is to say, for example, if the ECB wants to do a green TLTRO, I mean, they have to use a green taxonomy, which is consistent with the other green taxonomy used at the European level, including by the EIB. So that's the first thing, on first the taxonomy. And second, I think it should be on also the stance of monetary policy. I mean, if you, I mean, the EIB at the end is not so, it's not so large. I mean, partly because we have still a lot of national public development banks. So the ECB itself, the EIB itself does not have a huge impact on credit market condition, but still it could be, I mean, if you take all the public banks at the European level, it could be. So I think it's, and if you take into account, for example, what happened after 2008, I think in some ways there was some implicit coordination between the ECB and the different public development banks in Europe, because most public development banks in Europe had a very strong countercyclical credit policy, which was in tandem with the one of the ECB, but the interaction I think could have been much stronger. So happy to discuss that further.
Okay, thank you. I would suggest, because we have about 15 minutes left and there are a lot of questions, I would just pick some of them. Maybe we can you can answer, and Peter too, some of them. I would take the one of Marie Corman. Hearings and reports in the European Parliament proper means to hold the ECB to account? That's something I had in mind when you developed on the European Credit Council. Why does it have more impact? I remember when the euro was introduced, this was seen as a big progress, that the ECB has to be, the president of the ECB has to appear at the European Parliament, that there's been some accountability. Peter, we remember the Bundesbank doing nothing at that time, maybe a short notice, press notice. So the question is, why didn't it yet have more impact? Maybe because already now the head of the ECB is called to the European Parliament. I just get to another one, which is maybe going in the same, not very much in the same, but maybe just to add, Laura Inasu, could you please further elaborate your analysis on the central bank's dilemma between climate change and price stability? That was a point that you made. What do you think of climate inflation or greenflation? Yeah, maybe you can already answer these two.
So yeah, let me start with the ECB and the dialogue, the monetary policy dialogue. And so on this, there is now quite a large literature, especially by political scientists, who have studied in detail how this dialogue between the ECB, so the hearings take place, and I cite and I discuss their work in the book. And my interpretation of this is that there is an imbalance between the kind of evidence that the ECB can provide during this dialogue and the evidence that the MP can provide. So even when the MP, the member of the European Parliament, sometimes they can express some strong view on the ECB. I mean, some strong disagreement. I mean, it has appeared. It has happened. So it's not like the European Parliament is not doing anything or that they always agree with the ECB. I mean, you sometimes notice this strong disagreement, but it's very unbalanced because the ECB can always respond with standard models and forecasts. So at the end, the ECB will say, okay, we agree with your point But here are our predictions, here are our forecasts, here is what our model says. And then the debates, almost immediately stops because the European Parliament has not enough staff members. I mean, they have a lot of input from economists. I mean, there is for monetary dialogues, there are papers written by economists, which I think help the member of parliament to think about other alternatives. But there's still a big difference between an institution that can answer to all questions by saying, look, at the end, we have done all these scenarios and this is what we think, and the member of the European Parliament. So that's why what I suggest here, which is a bit modeled, I mean, part of it, actually the expertise part is modeled on what is a Congress Budget Office in the US, which would be a way to provide the Parliament with, a kind of equivalent expertise, so that they could do, when they ask the ECB, they will not only say, why are you buying corporate bonds? Why aren't you doing a green facility to help green finance and to disincentivize polluting investment? But we'll also be able to say, okay, we have done this scenario, and we're able to show that if you adopt a different policies, you could actually achieve the same objective with different side effects or with different things. So that's why I think this is not going on, just because there is a huge imbalance of expertise and of statistical modeling. And on the second question on the climate inflation and so on, so it could be, I mean, the problem now on climate inflation is that all things is that we still don't know very much. I mean, for the moment, I mean, anything can, you can find economic models or economic studies, pushing for one thing or the other. But something that we know, I think we know for sure, is the fact that there is, and for this, the example of renewable energy is the clearest example, I think. If there is no investment, enough investment in renewable energy, for example, this will have two consequences. First, the European countries will be more dependent on energy price shocks, especially related to coal. I mean, this is exactly what happened with the Ukraine war. Okay, if there's still a large part of the European system that depends on gas, and that gas is produced elsewhere, then we are more dependent. So you are more dependent to exactly the kind of shocks that happened after the war, the start of the war in Ukraine. Then you are also more dependent on the fact that if there is indeed an increase of CO2 prices implemented by government, which should happen, okay, which should happen. But it's not so much happening, but if indeed there is a willing policy with strong willingness to increase carbon prices, then if you don't have renewable energy, just like there will be a substitution would not happen soon enough. And then the other thing is that if you don't invest today in renewable energy, you will have, the climate crisis will continue. We will be on the scenario of having an increase in 3-4 degrees, and this is very well documented, is that it increases a lot any kind of economic shock, hotter summer, agricultural shock, and so on. So there is many arguments that says, okay, if you don't invest today enough in renewable energy, this will have an impact, a positive impact on your inflation in few years. I mean, this will increase inflation. So that's why we call this new dilemma, because if today the central bank is not able, I mean, just decrease the investment in renewable energy just to fight inflation today, actually the risk is that they will increase inflation tomorrow. So it's time inconsistent, which was, I mean, the other way to say that there is a time inconsistency problem. And this institution, I mean, as Peter was saying, that another strong justification of central bank independence is to have a longer horizon. And I think that what is happening today is that the response to inflation is actually not taking into account enough the longer horizon. We just show that, an independent institution itself is not because it's independent that automatically the policymakers will have this longer horizon. So it needs, the importance of the parliament, of civil society to say, okay, if you really want to think about this long horizon, you need to think differently about the interactions between prices and inflation and climate. And again, what I think interesting is this argument that, you know, it's an argument which in some ways can be perfectly orthodox when we're talking about price stability and time consistency. So even if you're an economist or a central banker who just think about price stability and time consistency, there is no reason today to avoid thinking about climate change. And I think this is important, but clearly not enough recognized in a central bank discourse today.
Okay.
Some short comments on this.
Yes,
Very short. Well, why is the monetary policy dialogue not as important? So I was there at the very first monetary policy dialogue in 1999. And the interesting thing is there was absolutely no public interest in it. I think that's the problem. There's no public audience. It's very, very limited event. And so I was really disappointed. So I thought, wow, this is a huge thing. The parliament is now challenging the ECB. There was no outside interest. Nobody's interested in it. So I think that's one of the problems why it does not have an impact. And then with the models, one must say, well, there are so many models making forecasts so that you don't need your own models. You could just compare the ECB's forecasts with what the IMF, the OECD, and everybody's doing. So, and one must say, in most cases, the ECB forecasts are very much in line with the others. So you cannot really. So I don't. Of course, I'm not against giving a kind of bigger staff to the parliament to do that. But I don't think if they come out with their models, they would be different from the mainstream models that you can have from all kind of institutions. And then the climate change and price stability. I wonder whether the dilemma is so huge. Yeah, because look at we had an oil price of $10 at the end of '99, and it went up to 120 or something in the peak. Yeah, and there was no problem for overall inflation. So if you have these processes on a kind of steady, longer term path, I think the inflation risk is very limited. So I don't, and there are also ECB has some estimates, and so I think from all kinds of models, they say this is not that it's not so impossible to keep 2% inflation and at the same time doing policy of climate change. By the way, we have now reached a level of energy prices which is so high compared to the prices by the end of 2019 that we have huge implicit carbon price. Yeah? So calculating against 2019, we have a carbon price in Germany of $150 per ton, euro per ton. So we have huge price effects already there. And in my view, one would not need that much for the next few years in terms of carbon price.
I agree on this, but we have seen how difficult. To achieve this. The impact on the economy has been huge. So if it happens again, I think that we should think about ways to tame this shock. To make this shock more smoother. Because we cannot afford all the difficulties.
So my solution is let the CO2 taxes have flexible CO2 prices compensating the market prices. So that for the final consumer, you get relatively constant energy price. But that's another story.
Different topic. But maybe if I can just get back to the question, what is the value added for having forecasts or whatever? I understand, and in that sense, I would agree with Peter that the ECB is already doing this survey of professional forecasters and so on. So they collect.
It's not so much forecast. Maybe it was confusing when I say forecast, because on this I agree with Peter that if you do the same kind of forecast that the IMF, you will. It's more like modeling alternative scenarios. I think it's something which is very important to me and I think we underestimate this, that in terms of economic modeling, there have been, of modeling, not only economic modeling, but there have been a huge impact of what the IPCC has been doing. clearly the political impact has been not enough. I mean, policymakers have not taken into account enough the policy recommendations, but this idea that you can think with different scenarios and saying, okay, here is the 2-degree scenarios, is the 3-degree scenarios, and so on. It's something which I think is changing a way that citizens and representatives can grasp very difficult issues, which are currently leading to climate expertise or ECB expertise. So I'm not talking here about fan charts of what is going to be seen. I'm talking about like alternative modeling. And if you see, and I think it's linked to what you were saying, Peter, is that there's a lot of NGO today. I mean, we are really saying, okay, the ECB should do something. When people who really know what is happening in the energy sector, what is happening to the environment, and say, the ECB is really at the core of something very important. And I think that this NGO, it's not something by chance that a lot of NGO involved in climate has developed a lot of expertise on central bank. And I think that this is clearly not enough reflected in the discussion that are taking place at the parliament, for example. And in these models, all the models that I integrate inflation and climate issues, they lead to quite different way to think about monetary policy and the use of interest rates as in very standard model. And these are developing, but these are clearly not anywhere in the discussion on monetary policy today, and not in the dialogue between the ECB and the parliament, for example.
Okay, we're running out of time. I would just, for the purpose of, it's quite easy to take the shortest question and maybe the concretest answer. Stanislav Jordan has asked who exactly would be appointed in the EU Credit Council and how.
Yeah. So there's been discussion on this already. I mean, the shortest, I mean, the most easy option, the easiest option would be just to have some people from some MP members, and also some of the some people who are just either independent or selected by parliament or selected by institution. That would be, but not only experts. I mean, just people interested in this, but not only economists. I think it's important to not only have economists. And then there would be people from the different bodies that are doing credit policy at the European level. So it could be from the EIB, it could be from the macroprudential councils, from the ECB, and also from the Commission. So there will be this idea of reflecting both the need for increasing coordination and also the increasing for collecting a diversity of opinion. But this is, I mean, this is a proposal. So obviously there are a lot of room for discussion on this.
Okay, so at least by this short answer to a short question, you have answered another question, which was a remark on suggestion not to only integrate economists.
Yes, no, it's very important. It's very, I think it's very, very important, and it's something which has been the case in many central banks in the past, and which have been forgotten. I think that it's in the past, many central banks had in their council, in their board, they had representatives from the union, also from the banks, from the agricultural sector, industrial sector. For some obvious reason, it will not be possible to do it at the ECB today, but it's something that could be done at this stage of the European Credit Council, for example.
Okay, thank you. I see that there's a hand. I mean, we wanted to stop, but if it's a very, very short question, Manfred Nitsch, can we? Yes. So please, very short, because Eric has to leave quite soon.
The chat is deactivated and questions and answers. There's only one, and that is mine. Namely, what is the role of the judiciary in controlling and in democracy? Montesquieu teaches us that there are more than two, not only legislative and executive orders, but what is the control of central banks by the judiciary? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. It's a very, very important question, and it's so I take back into account in the book because I think it's really, really key. And also for this reason, I think that now there have been a lot of really great discussions of central banks today by lawyers, by specialists of law, both in Europe and in the US. And I think that it tells something today. And the problem that there is a control, a judiciary control of the European Central Bank. And it was clear when there was two cases, two important ones, because there were many other ones, but at the European Court of Justice level. And here you see the problem. I mean, that what can the European Court of Justice can do on such technical issues, very, very technical issues, such as quantitative easing, long LTRO and something. And the problem is that how can the court assess the politics behind very seemingly technocratic instruments, so that asset purchase and so on. And the court has very little, was clearly in a position that was very difficult for the court to say anything. So at the end, they just say that the ECB what the ECB has done was right according to the EU treaty, but they say that everything should be justified. The ECB should justify more its policy choice, and that they are proportioned to the objective. And I think it's interesting because then the question comes as to say, okay, who is going to decide this? Who is going to, if the European Court of Justice say that the ECB should justify more, whether that what they do is proportion to the objective, does that mean that only the Court of Justice is able to decide which is the case, or should we have this debate at other levels? And I think this is why, again, that this stage of the parliament is important, because you cannot, obviously it's a democracy, so at the end, everything can be taken to the court. It's very important, but you need to think about the intermediate level. And the Court of Justice, they are never, they are not deaf to what is happening in the parliament or the civil societies. I mean, we see that in the Supreme Court or whatever. I mean, what the rulings evolved a lot according to what appeared as a consensus in society. So that's why that it's very important in that case to recognize that there is a judiciary control of the central bank everywhere. But actually, the judiciary control of the central bank also depends on the debate on the central bank choices. And these debates need to take place somewhere and to be more visible and more with more accountability and reflecting a more diversity of opinion than what is taking place right now. I hope it's clear, but
I must say I'm a little bit skeptical of the interference of laws into monetary policy, lawyers into monetary policy, and because as the German Constitutional Court has shown, the economic competence of these guys is not very high, and so that's really a risk if they get too much control. And so what I would think is more important is also to have this kind of ex post accountability. In your book, you say it's not that important. I think it would be important to ex post analyze at a certain point in time, was it the right decision that was taken or not? Using the information available, did they do the right thing? And I think, especially in the years 2007, 2008, 2011, there were huge mistakes made by the ECB, but they were never discussed because there is no kind of ex post monitoring. I think it would be helpful to see what went wrong, and I think would also have some kind of disciplining effect on the central bankers if they see, okay, there will be an ex post monitoring. Did we take into account everything that was relevant? And I think that is something which could easily be implemented, and I think it would at least be helpful.
Yeah, I fully agree. So it cannot be the role of the judiciary, because the judiciary cannot do ex post. But for the parliament, it should be. And the only case we had, and it's important to recognize, the good work of the parliament on this, was for the role of the ECB in the Troika, where there was a very strong report by the parliament saying that the legal legitimacy for the ECB to participate to the Troika was very, 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 very weak. And so it was a good example of ex post accountability, which I think has an impact, although it's not explicitly recognized, but clearly it will not happen in the same way again because of this ex post accountability. And I fully agree this should be done more, but it can only be from the parliament. There's no other institution that can do that, because the judiciary is not here to assess, as you said, because they cannot assess what is good in terms of economic policy at the end. So yeah.
Thanks. It seems that I don't have to apologize for extending your session.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Bruce.
Okay, thank you very much. I think in the sense of what we is one of our main ideas and missions at the forum to think about or to push and to contribute to a new economic paradigm and societal paradigm. This fits perfectly, as you mentioned at the beginning. It's about changing a long-standing paradigm in a very deep one, understanding of central banks and all the things that you mentioned. And this has guided policymaking, monetary policy for decades. And then a period of questioning comes, and then more and more thinking appears about how to replace the paradigm. And that's, I think, in the midst of what you have written about, and also explains and makes it quite normal that a lot of questions are open, and we are in the midst of discovering or searching for this new model, which integrates a lot of things that have not been considered for many decades. Thanks a lot, Eric. Thanks, Peter, for joining, and all those who have contributed or listened to this shortcut. We have copied the questions, and we will send it to the discussants if you allow, and then maybe if you want, you can give some comments, and we will put it in the follow-up of the session. Have a nice time. Eric will go back to Paris. He's still in Berlin and go back to Paris. It's not a long way, but
Neither, yeah.
And have a good time. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Thanks
Have a
again.
nice summer.